Hey guys, okay, I want to start introducing a little bit this book, Derrida's book, Rogues, or the first essay of it, The Reason of the Strongest. And this is to continue our discussion of democracy. So where we ended last time was we were talking about the sort of the need or the propulsion in our experience to establish a kind of environment that's universally inclusive, an environment that's open to anyone. That would be what I was calling sites of exposure, an environment of absolute indifference. So we were talking about why that might be a thing we would seek, and also why certain other things don't quite live up to that. Downtown in a different culture and so on. So that notion of an environment of universal inclusion is more or less what democracy means, or at least it's one sense that democracy can have. And so that's why we're turning really to that theme of democracy. And that's more or less what this essay in Derrida's book is about. It's about exploring what democracy means and what democracy has been, and sort of the relationship between those two things. Ultimately for the purpose of understanding the political exigencies that confront us now and how to think about them. That's the ultimate goal. But we're going to approach it by thinking about what democracy means. And let me start by reading a little bit of the book. So I'll tell you about Derrida. Derrida, if you've never read him before, even if you have, is hard to read in a different way than Heidegger is, for example, is difficult to read. Heidegger is difficult to read because Heidegger is very technical, and his language is quite abstract, and so every sentence is like a bit of a conceptual challenge. You just got to work through it. But the things he says are in a way pretty clear. You just got to learn the language and sit down with him to dig through his analyses and so on. Derrida is difficult in a different way. Derrida's very approach to language and to writing is sort of to not to rest with the familiar and easy ways we use language, but always to be sort of noticing and exploring some of the depths and complexities that are always sort of implied in the language we're using, but that we don't always notice. And so his writing can seem in a way playful. That's how people describe it sometimes, or irritating, because sometimes it just seems like he can't say something straight out. He says it and then he gets wrapped up in sort of wordplay and things like that. So you'll find that a lot in his book. As you start to read it, I think you'll see pretty quickly what I mean. It's easy to be put off by that. And if you've never read it before and you just start reading, you're going to find after a page you're getting nowhere. After 10 pages, you're getting nowhere. So it's the kind of thing where if you get some help reading, then it's a lot better. So a few things about Derrida. One, if you're ever reading anything by him, like a long essay, usually you have to go in a few pages and then you'll find a place where he finally comes down and says, so here's what I'm going to talk about. And that's what we're going to start with that. It's on page 11 it's on page 9 of this book. We're going to get to the place where he really actually says what he's going to talk about. So I'm going to take you to the right starting point. I'm going to help to explain I'm going to try to explain some of the big ideas that sort of Derrida is sort of working with, because then that will also help you to get a grip on some of the stuff. And once you get a little bit of bearings, once you get some bearings in the text, then in fact you will learn that you can deal with his more, so to speak, playful sentences. And there's actually quite a bit to learn from those sentences. It's just usually that's not where you want to start. If you start with that stuff, like you don't get anything. You really have to get into the heart of the thing first, before you're in a position to appreciate any of the significance of that little playfulness he has. And, so people get hung up on that. Sometimes people start reading and they just get wrapped up in the playfulness, and the result of that is they have nothing to say. They don't get anything out of it. So you don't do that. Just accept that there's going to be some difficulty in reading it, but try to follow some of the central lines I'm going to emphasize. And as you start to get a better sense of what he's doing, then you will find that you can kind of think along with him as he goes through the language. And those sentences, some of them at least, will make more sense. But, like anything else, he's a hard writer. He's a hard thinker. So it's like Hegel or Kant or Sartre or Plato or Aristotle, like any one of them. You don't get it all the first read. It takes a long time. So you have to expect that with him too, that it's not going to be something you could just read through like a novel. You got to study it. You got to work on little bits at a time, and over a long period of study, you'll start to really get it. But anyway, but so let me start then with what he says on page 9. Starting on line 3 of page 9, he says, "We do not yet know what democracy will have meant, nor what democracy is." We don't yet know what democracy is. And then he says, "For democracy does not present itself. It has not yet presented itself." Which roughly means there is no simply present reality that adequately lives up to the meaning of democracy. And part of his point is going to be that's not just a historical contingency. It just means that we've always sort of failed. There's something about the very nature of democracy that means it can't simply take a fully present form. But we'll come back to that. But anyway, he says, so democracy does not present itself. It has not yet presented itself. But he says, in the meantime, let's not stop using a word whose heritage is undeniable, even if its meaning is still obscured. So the fact is, there's a way we all have a sense of what that word means, and part of having a sense of it also means feeling in a way bound by it. Like we live with a sense of the imperative in democracy. So there's a way that word defines something real that we're all working within our situation. We're all sort of grappling with, even if we don't have a fully clear sense of what it means, right? So we're going to work from that. And then he says, so he says a little bit later that we are legatees of this Greek word. Yeah, democracy is a Greek word. And he says actually right before that line, he says, we do not yet know what we have inherited. This is an idea that's been handed down to us, and we've lived in that context of this inheritance, even though we don't quite know what it is. He says, there are, to be sure, claims or allegations of democracy everywhere that there is a we, everywhere we are. But we ourselves don't really know the meaning of this legacy, etc., etc. Anyway, so that's the starting point, right? So he's really going to raise a question of democracy. What is it? Basically. Let me go back a bit to the beginning of section 1. This is he's talking in a pretty rambling way here. So if you started reading on page 6, as you should have, or actually I guess you'd start reading a little bit before that, but if you started reading chapter 1, you no doubt were confused by this. But I'm going to read a little bit anyway. So this is the beginning of the third short paragraph. He says, this double question. So he says a question has been bugging him. He says this double question. He's not going to tell you what that question is until chapter 7. So you got to read whatever that is, 70 pages of this book before he comes down to telling you what the question is that he's trying to answer and talking about. He has a reason for doing that. But that is kind of his approach, like to leave you hanging, but hanging in a way where you're like, so what are we talking about? Anyway, but so we'll get to that double question later. But for the moment, let's just, based on what I was saying, let's just call it the question of democracy, because that's broadly what it is. His actual question is going to be a little more specific, but let's just say broadly it's the question of democracy. So this question, then he says in parentheses, this question at the same time semantic and historical. And by turns, semantic and historical. Okay, so semantic means meaning. It's a matter of meaning. So we can ask the question of democracy, and in a sense, that's a semantic question. Like, what do you mean by that word? It's a question sort of defining it. But also, when we ask the question of democracy, we're asking a historical question. We're asking, when you want to know what democracy means, it's not just a matter of semantics in the sense of defining it. It's also a matter of clarifying what the historical reality is that that word has named, what democracy has been. So democracy, in that sense, is both a semantic and a historical issue. So he draws on that quite a bit. He explains that a little bit more fully on pages 24 to 25. So that's it. This is in section 2. And I'll come back to a little bit more about section 2 a little bit later. At the bottom of page 24, at the bottom of page 24, he's 3 lines up, he refers to the semantic vacancy or indetermination at the very center of the concept of democracy. So that relates to that thing I initially read from page 9, where he says we don't know what democracy is. So he's saying there's actually something about the very meaning of the term democracy that leaves its sense, that leaves what it means not fully determined. I'll say more about that in a second. But he says the semantic vacancy or indetermination at the very center of the concept of democracy makes its history turn. So he's saying at some level it's because of a kind of semantic indeterminacy that there has been this interesting and complex history, concrete history of democracy. And I'm going to say just one more thing about that. Just going to draw your attention to this passage, one more passage that sounds similar. There are many themes. He announces many themes in these opening pages, and he's going to be revisiting them throughout the book. And so the first chapter, especially the first chapter, but more than that, the first 2 at least, but especially that first chapter, is almost just a naming of ideas that he's going to go on to talk about. So it's kind of an introduction. It's kind of like a list. So you're introduced to some ideas that the meaning of which is gradually going to be unfolded for you. But anyway, so I wanted to just draw your attention to one more point where this thing I was just referring to comes up prominently. So this is on page 72. He says, is that the 7 or so lines up from the bottom of 72? He says, democracy is already in Greek a concept that is inadequate to itself, a word hollowed out at its center by a vertiginous semantic abyss that compromises all translations and opens onto all kinds of autoimmune ambivalences and antinomies. You don't have to worry about that. Those are technical words he's going to deal with. But it's a concept that is inadequate to itself. So there's something about the very meaning of democracy, the very notion of democracy, that doesn't allow its meaning to be easily resolved and settled. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what a few of those specifics are after I first let the cat out. So let's explore just a little bit that notion of democracy being a concept that's inadequate to itself. But I want to say one more thing first. Before getting into those sort of the specific things there, I want to go back to page 9 because on page 9 he has another way of articulating the question, and this way of articulating it gets back to what I was saying in the lectures leading up to this about where this issue is coming from. So he says. Sorry, I thought it was page 9. It's not page 9. I think this must be page 11. Yeah, it's page 11. He says, it's about halfway down the page, the second line of the paragraph that starts on that page, he says, the question of the democracy to come might take the following form, among others: what is living together? And especially, so let's that one first. What is living together? Right, so he's first of all trying to take a step behind this concept we've named democracy. Like he's sort of saying, democracy is presented as a kind of answer to a question. What's the question it's answering? Well, it's this more basic question. What is living together? Because that's in a way what we're after. When we have a home, that's a kind of living together, but that the very character of the living together in a home, as we have been seeing, is that it involves not accepting some other people to live with you, right? It's an inherently exclusionary structure that is, in some significant ways, inherently antagonistically defined in relationship to others. And so that's why we were then pursuing this question of a more open environment, a more inclusive environment. So what would it really be for us all to live together? What would that be? And then he says, here's then a follow-up to that question. And he's going to get a little bit into language that's awkward, but I think his point will be clear enough. He says, and especially then the question would be, what is a like, which means someone like me? Or he says a compeer. You could just say a peer, but someone who's comparable to you, someone that you experience as one of us, someone that you experience as like you, someone that is such that we're together in this, right? So especially we could ask, what is a like or a compeer? That is to say, someone similar or semblable, like appears similar, as a human being, a neighbor, a fellow citizen, a fellow creature, a fellow man, and so on. So we're asking, what is it to live together? And therefore, what is it to have someone as a human being like me, or a fellow citizen, a fellow, etc., right? What is involved in those experiences of mutually recognizing each other as part of the same, right? And then he says, but we could even go a little farther, and we could say, or even, must one live together only with one's like, with someone semblable? And so that last question is going to raise then a further issue. But I want to read that first to help put you back in touch with the philosophical question that our everyday notion of democracy, our political notion of democracy, is setting out to answer. And so, one of the things that I think is most especially powerful about Derrida is that the way he writes is he doesn't so much take up philosophical issues and show you new answers. I mean, he does that too. He's a very brilliant guy. But the force of his writing is often more to bring you back in touch with the deeper, sort of almost existential core question that all the answers were supposed to be about. So in a way, the effect of his philosophizing is not so much to give you a new answer as to, maybe for the first time, get you to really understand the question. And so that's kind of the freshness of it. And you might see a little comparison there with Heidegger talking about anxiety, right? And being taken out of a home experience and losing the familiar sources of meaning and being put in a situation where you're suddenly confronted with the inescapable urgency of figuring out how to make sense of this. And so if you remember that Heideggerian sort of point in general, Derrida's whole project is kind of like that. His works are all in a way like that, but at the level of taking our deepest and most pressing philosophical, political, interpersonal, ethical concerns, whatever they are, and by rigorous engagement with them, getting us to the point where we actually have to ask the question, where in fact we've always just been assuming an answer. So that's kind of the way he goes. Anyway, so that's why I wanted to start with that passage there, just to get you to start moving you towards asking the question, to taking democracy as a question rather than thinking you have the answer to things. Oh, democracy, right? Take democracy as a question. Anyway, so now let me look a little bit at some of those tensions, some of the reasons why democracy is a concept inadequate to itself. I'm gonna just introduce a few of the ones that he introduces in his section, chapter 1, chapter 2, and I think I'm going to draw a little bit on chapter 6 also, because that's pretty closely related content-wise with what goes on in chapter 2. Our big studies are going to be chapter 3 and chapter 7. Those are the biggest ones for us, and then 8 and 9. But 3 and 7, I think, actually all 3, 7 and 8 are all quite big, and 9 is sort of paired with 8. But 1, 2, and 6 are a little bit more introductory, I think, and chapters 4 and 5 are quite interesting in their own right. But they're oriented towards talking about the work of a particular work by Jean-Luc Nancy, and he raises very important issues that are relevant to Derrida's topic, but not so central to the thing we're after. But there's some pretty powerful things in 1, 2, and 6 just to introduce these issues. So that's where I'm going to draw on now, and then the next time we're going to really get into it when we start looking at section 3. But so let me start with that last one, that point he made about what is living together, and then he says, what is a compeer? What is it like to experience someone else as like? Oh, I'm a human being, you're a human being. Like that's kind of the idea behind something like universal human rights, right? Universal human rights we imagine to be something universally inclusive, where we say we recognize everybody as the same in the sense that we're all human, and that means you have these rights. Section 8C of sites of exposure is really I got that here, is really prominently, essentially about that issue. So we'll be coming back to that next week also. But so like, what is living together? So it's like, what is it to experience someone as like, as a human being, or as just even as a fellow citizen, whatever it is. He even says at one point a fellow man. We'll come back to that exact expression in a minute. But for the moment, let's just say, what is it, use his more broad expression, what is it to recognize someone as a compeer? So it's and then remember he said after that, he said, or even, must one live together only with one's like? And so then that's related to a question that he first raises in chapter 1, but it's a pretty big one. He first raises it on section 14. He says, so what's the problem with the concept of democracy? Well, here he's going to say democracy seems to have two different meanings that are kind of opposed to each other. Both of them seem pretty important. Both of them seem integral to what we have meant by democracy, but they don't sound like the same thing at all. So he says, I should perhaps confess that what tortures me, the question that has been putting me to the question, might just be related to what structures a particular axiomatic of a certain democracy, namely the turn or the return to self of the circle and the sphere, and thus the ipseity of the one, the autos of autonomy, symmetry, homogeneity, the same, the like, the semblable, or the similar, and even finally God. Lots of his word stuff in there, but basically he's saying there's a truth of autonomy, there's a particular kind of democracy, a particular truth of democracy that is, it's about the same and the self, right? And he says that clashes with another truth of the democratic, namely the truth of the other, heterogeneity and the heteronomic, the no matter who. So to some extent, democracy is about recognizing and living together with the same, recognizing everybody as the same. But on the other hand, he says there's another truth of democracy that's sort of supposed to be precisely about recognizing what's different. Now, surely you can imagine various situations in which one and the same thing, in one sense, could be described as same, and in one sense could be described as different. That comes up at all kinds of things, all kinds of situations. So strawberry ice cream is the same as chocolate ice cream in as much as they're both ice cream. So they're kind of the same thing, but they're different, right? One's strawberry, one's chocolate. So it's not automatically an issue to say, oh, you said they were the same, but they're actually different. Often that just means you're kind of changing the register at which you speak. So you might think, oh, well, surely this is just a matter of figuring out what you mean on any given occasion. But he's actually going to say no. The issue he's talking about is deeper than just that kind of almost sophistical wordplay. That there is a deeper way in which there's a fundamental thread of the meaning of democracy that is about the self and self-sameness. And there's another thread that's about self-non-sameness and difference. And those two, conceptually and practically, don't fit together too easily. So that's one of the things that he's naming here that we're going to go on to see more about. Starting, I think, next week when we read chapter 3. I just want to read you the beginning of chapter 6, because then he picks up on that point pretty directly. So the beginning of chapter 6, this is page 63. Well, I'll read from the beginning. Don't worry if the first couple of lines you don't know what he's talking about. That's fine. You'll get it soon enough. So he says, so how not to speak of brothers? In its constitutive autoimmunity, like up to there you don't know what he's talking about. But anyway, in its constitutive autoimmunity, in its vocation for hospitality, democracy has always wanted by turns and at the same time two incompatible things. It is wanted on the one hand to welcome only men, and on the condition that they be citizens, brothers, and compeers, excluding all the others, in particular bad citizens, rogues, non-citizens, and all sorts of unlike and unrecognizable others. And, on the other hand, at the same time or by turns, it has wanted to open itself up to offer hospitality to all those excluded. I just wanted to read you that passage where he's saying, like, democracy has really meant two different things. The recognition of the like, the inclusion of the excluded. And they're not the same. And one thing he said in there that you might have noticed is democracy has often meant it only wants to include men. Women have been one of the things that have been excluded. And there have been lots of other lines of exclusion too, of course, around matters of race, around matters of class, all kinds of things. So some of that we will come back to. But I want just to name that first. So that's the first kind of tension I wanted to name in the very concept of democracy. Second one is this is what chapter 2 is about. And he says, democracy is also, it's about freedom. Democracy is supposed to be about freedom for the people and so on. That's a big part of what the if you're going to try to explain what democracy is about or why it should be there, that's what you're going to say. And so here he especially refers back to Plato's Republic. Plato, in Book 8 of the Republic, Plato has the most amazing analysis of democracy. And it's really nice, I think, that Derrida spends so much time in this book taking the things that Plato says there so seriously. He works in considerable detail through the very specific things that come out in Book 8 of the Republic, and he's very attentive to the complexity of that text. And it really is one of the most amazing texts for the study of democracy, even though it's very brief. It's just a handful of pages. But anyway, so Derrida here refers back to a part of that discussion in the Republic. And he says there, Socrates is talking with Glaucon and Adeimantus, and they say, like, what's democracy about? Well, it's about freedom. Yeah, isn't it the place where everybody's free? Isn't that the idea? Everybody's supposed to be free. Yeah, that's the idea, right? So I'm not going to, at the moment, put any particular work into making the connection between openness, democracy, freedom, but I'm taking that to be a familiar enough idea that you can pretty immediately see that there are those connections. Anyway, so I just want to talk a little bit about freedom, because here he says, page 21, he says, in that talk in the Republic, well, he's going to talk about the Republic in a minute, but he even before he talks about that, on 21 he says, This is, I don't know, 15 or 20 lines up from the bottom of 21. This is just into the second paragraph that begins on that page. He says, it has always been hard to distinguish with regard to free will between the good of democratic freedom or liberty and the evil of democratic license. And that's what he then relates to Book 8 of the Republic. That's what gets him into it. And so in 22, after that quotation, he says, we must never forget that this portrait of the democrat associates freedom or liberty, the Greek word eleutheria, with license, exousia, which can mean whim, freedom, free will, etc., etc. He's drawing a distinction between the Greek words eleutheria and exousia, and those are the words that he's often translating as liberty, eleutheria, and license, exousia. Or, the title of this chapter is License and Freedom. Ignoring translations, let me just try to get to that point. We can use freedom to mean different things. And sometimes people take freedom to mean, oh, you're just free to do anything you want. That's license. And one of the points that Socrates makes in the discussion of the Republic and elsewhere is that that's a pretty... he says that's a pretty thin definition of what freedom is. That it's true that's a phenomenon of freedom, but there are deeper meanings to freedom. One of the most basic ones is something like capacity. If you grow up and learn how to speak, let's say English, which I'm speaking, you become, through that disciplined process of learning, you become free to express yourself. And that's an amazing power, the power to express yourself. You take it for granted because you know your language, and it's you can express yourself. But take away your learning of language, and you're in that spot of an infant, which literally means one without language. You're in the spot of that, like my son a couple of years ago, when he could get a little bit communicated by his expressions and his hands, but nothing like what he can say now when he's got, a whole language at his disposal. Or, this is the thing that happens. People have accidents and they lose their ability to speak, and man, they lose so much of their ability to interact with people, and it seems in significant ways they lose their ability to think. In other words, that language isn't just a coding of thought, but that the ability to think to speak is something like the ability to articulate, and losing the ability to speak is something like becoming crippled in your very capacity to articulate. So that the link between thinking and speaking is very tight. So you lose your language, and it's like you can never quite get that thing you're trying to get. You can never quite get clear. So just think about what you lose. Actually, on that last point, you might remember what Heidegger was talking about discourse and articulation, and so on. That might relate to that point I just made. Anyway, I'd just like you to think about what you lose if you lose language. And the reason I'm saying that is, you can think about freedom as, if you think of it as the freedom to express yourself, not so much like, oh, you can say whatever you want in that sense that nobody's going to stop you, but in the sense that you have the developed ability to do something. And that came through learning, and it came through learning a specific thing, because you had to learn English, or you had to learn French, or you had to learn Turkish, or you had to learn Marathi, or you had to learn, Mandarin or something like that. You learn a specific system of language that is historically rooted in particular cultures, and by learning that language, you get to speak with particular large groups of people, but not others, right? Unless you learn other languages and so on. My reason for emphasizing the specificity of that is to emphasize that what's involved in learning. Like, you got to learn something very specific. You got to learn this word and this way of using verbs and this way of constructing a sentence. It's a very, very disciplined process. Because when you were learning it, your first language when you were a kid, because you learned it in that child way of going from nothing to having something, and you did it by like figuring stuff out, by interacting with your parents and so on, before you had any developed mental life, that stuff's long gone. And so you don't really know what you went through to learn it. And so for all of us, it seems almost like a natural fact that we have language. But nobody was born speaking English, and nobody was born speaking French, and nobody was born speaking Marathi. Right? Everybody who speaks those things learned very specific things from very specific other people. And if that same child who was born in Mumbai had been born in Toronto, she'd learn English, not Marathi. Right? So you could have been something else, and that would have involved learning different things. But it's by that process of learning that you become free to speak. So there, freedom is associated with discipline, with the opposite of license. It's associated with holding yourself down to obeying precise rules and only doing this and using this word on this occasion and learning to follow instructions, etc., etc. Right? Same thing with learning how to play a guitar or learning how to play whatever, hockey. Like, you got to learn the rules, you got to learn the skills, you got to learn the very specific things, and it's a process of discipline. So freedom there is about binding yourself. Freedom there is about submitting to being ruled so that you will be empowered. And when you are subsequently empowered, your actions are then not arbitrary. Your actions have taken in the norms and values of that thing you were being trained in, the thing you were learning, and consequently the rich and meaningful things you do are disciplined and norm governed. Right? So there you can see freedom in that rich and powerful sense means the opposite of license, and in a way, freedom as license depends upon freedom as discipline. And if you didn't have that freedom as discipline, you're not even a person for whom license makes any sense. Right? Yeah, you got nothing. You got no power. Right? So here now is the second issue, that if democracy is supposed to be a regime of freedom, what does that mean it's after? Is it after universal discipline or universal license? Right? Does it mean anybody can do whatever they want, which is how people in 2020 on the news sort of often talk about democracy? Or, on the contrary, is it about establishing a regime that is oriented towards facilitating the development of the freedom of everybody? In other words, it's going to be a system that has education. It's going to put money into education and things like that. It's going to put money into the things that allow people to develop and become free in that rich sense. Right? That's a very different political orientation than the one that says, oh, we're going to have a regime that lets anybody do anything they want. Right? It's very different to be oriented towards exousia, or license, and eleutheria, freedom in that other sense, which Derrida here is translating liberty. I don't know that much about the significance of the word liberty in English language political thought, so I'm reluctant to use it because I suspect that's a minefield. But so let's just contrast. I'm going to contrast freedom in a rich sense with freedom as license. But so that's the second one. So there's democracy about including all the same, or democracy about including the different. There's democracy as cultivating freedom in that substantial sense, or freedom as exousia or license, very different notions. But let's pick up on that last one, freedom as exousia. Like, the way I just told that story about learning a language or learning a guitar can make it sound like what you really want is a democracy that's going to educate people and, let people become strong and powerful. And surely there's lots of good in that. But let me say a word in favor of democracy as in favor of exousia. Remember, I showed you that picture, the Jeff Wall picture of what's it called, in front of a nightclub. That's exousia. It's like when you're a teenager, you want to be able to go out and do what you want to do, and you want to be free of school and parental discipline, and you want some license. You want to be able to do the things that to you seem like they'd be fun. Like, that's the free will you want. You want to be free to dispose of your life and your time the way you want, with whomever you want, when you want, and so on. So I want you to think about that. So I guess what I want you to see is that there's actually a pretty strong reason for thinking about the importance of both freedom as maybe liberty in the sense of liberating, freedom in the sense of through discipline and education allowing people to have the power to do things, versus freedom as allowing people the license to do whatever they feel like. I think I want you to be able to see that there's a good reason for both of those. And a lot of the sense of wanting to get out of the family home to the environment of indifference is you want exousia. You want freedom as license. And so chapter 6, which is called The Rogue That I Am, is especially about that. It's especially about the way that, in a way, historically, democracy has often been about trying to allow license, trying to make room for the outlaw, for the rogue. Hence the title of the book, Rogues. So that's enough about that. One last point. I want to just bring up, I think, a third tension. There's more, but these three will be enough to get us started. And this one. Imagine what you take a democracy to be, where people get together and make a decision collectively. Well, what is it to make a collective decision? Well, people talk. That's the collective part. They discuss. How does the decision happen? Derrida says, at some level, a decision is a sovereign act. Something has to happen that lets a decision be made. How's it going to come about? Is it going to be an individual who says, okay, I've heard all your opinions, I think this is what we're going to do? Or is it going to be voting, where you count votes and the majority rules? Who knows? But a decision has to be made. And so there will always be an end to discussion, and a new thing happens. Okay, now we're making the decision, and you got some means, some decision-making procedure. But in place of that collective activity in which there is no sovereign, and the whole idea of democracy in a way is supposed to be to get away from the king, to get away from the sovereign, and have it be the power of the people. Well, at some point you're going to get away from the people, and you're going to get to a sovereign act that makes a decision. And so again, you might be able to think of some circumstances where you don't see too much of a tension there. That's nice. But mostly there's a huge tension there. And he's going to be focusing on that one a lot, about the way that democracies kind of have to flip back and forth between two quite different interpretations of what they are. Are they this sort of collective discussion and deliberation, or are they sovereign decisions? And he's going to be exploring he's going to be exploring how those two are different, why they're both in a way necessary to the way we've thought about democracy, and why that turns out to be quite a problem. So those three then are three particular tensions in the very concept of democracy that I want you then to be thinking about as you enter into this book. I want you to think about this difference between a space that's shared between likes versus a space that is an engagement with someone who's unlike. I want you to think about the difference between cultivating freedom in that substantial sense, which we might associate with the word liberty, or freedom in the sense of license or exousia. And I want you to think about that alternation between, let's say, deliberation and decision, or discussion and decision, between collectivity and sovereign act. There's much more to pursue about all of them, but those three are quite rich ones to explore, to start getting into why it's easy to say democracy, but it's not so easy to realize, partially because you don't quite know what you mean. And I'm not using that to mock anything or to say that it's unimportant. On the contrary, it's a hugely important thing. But there's something about the very nature of democracy, what he calls a semantic indetermination, that makes it in its very nature a bit of a problem, and maybe an insoluble problem. So let me leave that there. And so then we'll come back next time, and for Derrida we're going to be looking at chapter 3, which is called I think it's called something like the Other of Democracy, and in Sites of Exposure we're going to look at lesson 8c, which is going to be about that theme of human rights basically, and the reality and history of the attempt to make a universally inclusive space. So Derrida was saying that this semantic indeterminacy has as its consequence, or as its necessarily counterpart, a kind of historical concreteness to democracy, a variety in the historical ways in which people have tried to make democracy present, to make it happen. And so section 8c of Sites of Exposure is really about that issue, especially in sort of the Western history, and the notion of human rights as an attempt to make a kind of universally inclusive world. We're going to look at both how, in Sites of Exposure, we're going to look at both how and why you might think that's working, and what are some of the ways that has happened, and then also what some of the problems are that are associated with these kinds of things Derrida talks about. Anyway, so that's what we're going to go on to next, is 8c of Sites of Exposure and chapter 3 of that first essay in Rogues. Okay.